The gods of the north did not defeat monsters. They murdered their own family. And then they spent 1,000 years making sure you never heard it that way. That is the accusation. And by the end of this story, you will understand why it holds. The Norse called them the Jotnar, the giants. They were not beasts crouching in the forests. They were older than the gods, older than the world, the living body of frost and stone and fire and everything that will not be tamed. And yes, they were terrible. But look closely at the ones who killed them, because the bloodlines tell a story the sagas whisper rather than shout. Odin, the All-Father, the highest of the gods, carried giant blood through his own mother. Thor, the great slayer of giants, was born of a giantess. Every giant he ever crushed was kin on his mother's side. And Loki, a full-blooded giant, did not lurk in Jotunheim. He sat in the halls of Asgard, ate at their table, and was sworn a brother to Odin himself. So understand what you are actually watching. This was never a war between gods and monsters. This was a family tearing itself apart. And that changes everything. Because the Vikings who told these stories lived under a law harder than iron. A killing could be paid for. A price in silver argued before the assembly, and the feud could end. But the killing of your own blood had no price. There was no silver deep enough. Blood demanded blood, and the debt would be collected, no matter how many generations it took to come knocking. And the debt was never paid. To understand how enormous that debt truly was, we have to go back to the very first body. Before the world, there was Ginnungagap, a void so vast and so silent that the Norse could only describe it as a yawning gap waiting to be filled. To one side lay a realm of ice, to the other, a realm of fire. And when the rivers of ice finally crept close enough to feel the heat, they began to melt. And in that first slow thaw, the universe produced its first living thing. Not a god, a giant. His name was Ymir, and he was enormous beyond measure, a body the size of a country breathing alone in the dark. As he slept, he sweated, and from that sweat came more giants, generation after generation, until an entire race existed. Every frost giant who would ever live came out of him. He was not simply a creature. He was the source. And to the Norse, his children were not fairy tales. They were the blizzard that buried a village. They were the winter that refused to break. They were the mountain that cracked open and rained fire, and the ground that shuddered and swallowed a farm whole. Now here is what makes what happened next so damning. And to feel it, you have to understand how the Vikings themselves judged a killing. In their world, almost every death had a price. It was called the man price, a sum in silver, argued out before the assembly, paid to the family of the dead so the feud could be closed and the community could survive. Nearly any blood could be settled, but there was one killing that no silver could ever cover, and every Norseman knew it. To murder your own kin was to commit the unforgivable thing. A man who did that was called neathing, stripped of honor, cast out, no longer counted among human beings at all. And Ymir, the first giant, the ancestor of chaos, was also something else. Through Bestla, a giant's daughter, Ymir's blood ran in the veins of Odin himself. The first being in existence was not merely the enemy of the gods. He was their family. And the three brothers picked up the knife anyway. Odin, Vili, and Ve fell upon their ancestor and killed him. And when a body that size opens, it does not simply bleed, it floods. Ymir's blood rose in a black tide across the emptiness, and it drowned them. Nearly every giant in existence. An entire race, erased in a single afternoon of violence. Then the brothers went to work on the corpse. His flesh they packed down into the earth you are standing on. His blood they poured out and called it the sea. His bones they raised up as mountains. His teeth they scattered as stone. And his skull they lifted overhead and stretched wide until it became the sky itself. Everything you have ever seen was cut from the body of a murdered relative. But something happened in that flood the sagas mention almost in passing, so quietly you could miss it. As the blood rose, a hollowed vessel floated on the tide. Inside it was a giant named Ymir and his wife, and they rode that ocean of their own family's blood until it settled. They lived. And from those two, the entire race of giants was born again. Think carefully about what that means. The gods committed something close to extinction and left a witness. 2 survivors who watched every drop of it and who would tell their children exactly what the gods had done and exactly what was owed. The killing was never the end. It was the beginning of the reckoning. And the gods could not bury the evidence because they had built the world out of it. They could not hide the body. They were living inside it. Every mountain a Viking climbed was a bone. Every ocean he sailed was blood. The entire crime scene was the planet. And so the debt was not paid. It only grew, out there at the frozen edges of the world, passed down through the children of the one survivor. Sooner or later, the giants would come to collect, so the gods needed someone who could hold them off by force. They needed a collector of their own. And his name was Thor. Thor was the answer the gods reached for whenever the debt came too close. In his hands, they placed Mjolnir, a hammer beaten into shape in the fires of the dwarven smiths. And it was not simply a weapon. Thrown, it flew straight and always returned to his fist. It could call the lightning down out of an empty sky. It could break a fortress into gravel and open a mountain like a skull. And Thor used it again and again, walking into Jotunheim whenever the giants grew bold. He smashed skulls. He shattered fortresses. He turned living giants into stories told in the dark. But here is the thing the sagas never let him say out loud. Thor's mother was a giantess. His own blood ran back into the very race he spent his life destroying. Every skull he broke belonged to someone who was, in some distant way, family. And the more that truth pressed against him, the harder he swung. Because violence was the only language he had that could drown it out. Until the day violence stopped working. Thor came to the hall of a giant king called Loki and was offered 3 simple contests. Empty this drinking horn. He drank until his ribs burned and the level barely moved. Lift this grey cat off the floor. He heaved with everything he had and raised a single paw. Wrestle this old woman. And the strongest being in creation was slowly, patiently forced down to one knee. He left that hall humiliated. And then the giant king did something strange. He told Thor the truth. The horn had been secretly joined to the sea, and Thor had drunk so deep he pulled down the tides of the ocean. The cat was no cat. It was the Midgard serpent, the monster coiled around the entire world, and Thor had lifted it until the heavens shook. And the old woman was old age itself, which has never been thrown by anyone who has ever lived. Understand what happened there. Loki could have killed him. He chose to teach him instead. He wanted Thor to see, with his own hands, the shape of his limits. Because you cannot break the ocean with a hammer. You cannot break old age with a hammer. And you cannot break a blood debt with a hammer. Thor understood, and he did the only thing he knew. He turned in fury and swung Mjolnir at the fortress behind him. But the fortress was gone. The hall, the king, the whole illusion vanished. The hammer passed through empty air. For the first time in his life, Mjolnir struck nothing at all. And the debt was not paid. Because the collector was already waiting for his day to come, and he had been living inside Asgard the entire time. His name was Loki. A giant by blood, sworn as a brother by Odin himself, seated at the table of the very gods who had slaughtered his kind. The debt did not have to break down the gates of Asgard. It had been eating dinner there for centuries, and it was Loki's own children who had finished the work. The wolf Fenrir and the Midgard serpent, the very monster Thor had once lifted in a giant king's hall. When the day came, the Norse called it Ragnarok. The fire giants rode out of Muspelheim with blades of flame. The frost giants marched across seas frozen solid, and Loki led them home. Thor met the serpent one last time and killed it, then took 9 steps and dropped dead from its venom. Odin, wisest of them all, was swallowed whole by the wolf. The giants won. The world burned, the seas rose, and everything ended. But this was never a random catastrophe. Read it as a Viking would, and it is something far colder. It is justice. Blood answers blood, and a feud ends only when one family is wiped from the earth. The gods knew that law perfectly, because it was their law. They simply never expected to be the ones standing at the wrong end of it. And here is the part that should truly unsettle you. Why do we only ever hear the god's side? Because most of what survives was written down by Snorri Sturluson, a Christian politician in Iceland, around the year 1220, more than 200 years after the North had already abandoned the old gods. History was recorded by the winners of a different war entirely. Some scholars believe the giants were once respected, even revered, before they were quietly demoted into monsters. That is the legend hidden from history. So how did the Vikings defeat the giants? They didn't. Nobody wins a blood feud. There is only whoever pays last. And every generation inherits a war it never started. A father's grudge, an old wound, a bill borrowed by someone else and handed to you. So when the debt finally reaches your hands, ask yourself honestly, do you pay it in blood, or are you the one brave enough to end it? If stories like this one stay with you, stay with us here at Shadows of Valhalla, where the sagas of the North were never really about gods. They were always about us.